Let me be direct with you from the outset, because what unfolded in Damascus in the early hours of April 27th demands directness. What we witnessed was not a spontaneous eruption of violence. It was not, as several Western outlets characterized it, a breakdown in ceasefire protocols. What we witnessed was a meticulously timed military operation that commenced exactly 11 hours after Russia, Turkey, and Iran signed a tripartite stabilization agreement in Astana, Kazakhstan. 11 hours. Not days, not weeks. 11 hours after the ink dried on a document that was supposed to freeze military positions across northwestern Syria for 90 days. I am looking at satellite imagery that has been circulating among regional security analysts for the past 36 hours, and I need you to understand what it shows. What it shows is not the aftermath of sporadic clashes between government forces and opposition groups. It is not the result of local commanders acting independently. What it shows is a coordinated assault involving at least 7 distinct attack vectors launched simultaneously across a 40-kilometer front stretching from Idlib province to the outskirts of Aleppo. The synchronization alone tells you this operation required weeks of planning, pre-positioned assets, and external logistical support that could only have come from state-level actors. In the next 19 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why this explosion of violence was neither accidental nor surprising, why the agreement signed in Astana was probably obsolete before the delegates even left the building, and why what happens in Syria over the next 72 hours will determine whether we are witnessing the final chapter of this conflict or the opening of an entirely new phase that pulls in actors who have carefully stayed on the margins until now. This analysis is based on open source intelligence, confirmed military movements, and statements from officials across multiple governments who are saying very different things in public than what their actions on the ground reveal. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is not speculation. This is pattern recognition based on 13 years of Syrian conflict dynamics, and the pattern that is emerging right now is one we have seen before, but never at this scale and never with this many external powers holding contradictory objectives in the same geographic space. Let's start with the Astana Agreement itself, because the document that Russia, Turkey, and Iran signed on April 26th was remarkable not for what it promised, but for what it conspicuously avoided addressing. The agreement established 3 so-called de-escalation monitoring zones. Zone 1 covering rural Idlib, Zone 2 covering the M4 highway corridor that connects Latakia to Aleppo, and Zone 3 covering a buffer area south of the Turkish border extending roughly 30 kilometers into Syrian territory. Each signatory committed to deploying observation posts, coordinating air operations to avoid fratricide, and halting offensive operations for 90 days to allow humanitarian access and potential reconciliation talks. What the agreement did not address was the presence of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the former al-Qaeda affiliate that controls an estimated 60 to 65% of Idlib province and has explicitly rejected any ceasefire that does not include full withdrawal of Syrian government forces from what it considers liberated territory. The agreement did not address Turkish military positions inside Syria that Ankara considers permanent border security installations, but that Damascus considers illegal occupation. And the agreement certainly did not address the fact that Iranian-backed militias and Russian air assets have, over the past 6 weeks, been steadily repositioning for exactly the kind of operation we saw explode 11 hours after the signing. According to reporting by Reuters and confirmed by multiple regional security officials, Syrian government forces supported by Russian air cover launched the assault at approximately 2 a.m. local time on April 27th. The operation began with artillery barrages targeting opposition positions in the towns of Sarakib, Marat al-Numan, and the western outskirts of Idlib city. Within 90 minutes, ground forces supported by Iranian-aligned militias advanced along the M5 highway, the critical north-south artery that connects Damascus to Aleppo. By dawn, government forces had seized the town of Sarakib, which sits at the junction of the M4 and M5 highways, a location of immense strategic value because it controls access to both Idlib city and the Turkish border crossings. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing you are not getting this level of analysis anywhere else. Now let's talk about what this operation actually accomplished and why the timing was not coincidental. Announcement number 1, the seizure of Sarakib, and this one matters more than anything else happening in this theater right now because Sarakib is not just another town that changes hands in the grinding back and forth of the Syrian conflict. Sarakib is the node. It is the highway junction that determines who controls supply lines into Idlib province, who controls access to the Turkish border, and who controls the ability to sustain a long-term military presence in northwestern Syria. Syrian government forces and their allies have attempted to take Sarakib 4 separate times since 2019. They succeeded in holding it twice for a combined total of 11 weeks before Turkish-backed forces pushed them out. This time, according to analysis from the Institute for the Study of War and confirmed by geolocation data from multiple sources, the government advance was supported by Russian airstrikes that specifically targeted Turkish observation posts that were supposed to be monitoring the ceasefire under the Astana framework. Think carefully about what that means. Russian aircraft struck Turkish military positions hours after Russia signed an agreement with Turkey promising coordination and de escalation. The strikes did not cause mass casualties. Turkish officials reported 3 soldiers wounded, not killed, but the message was unmistakable. The Astana Agreement, from Russia's perspective, does not constrain operations against what Moscow classifies as terrorist organizations, and Moscow has made clear that it considers Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and any force operating in proximity to HTS as legitimate targets regardless of Turkish objections. Received. That is announcement number 1. Announcement number 2, Turkey's response, or more accurately, Turkey's non-response. This is the part that reveals the deeper negotiations happening beneath the surface. Within 6 hours of the government assault, Turkish President Erdogan convened an emergency national security meeting. The readout from that meeting, published by Turkey's state-run Anadolu agency, condemned the Syrian government offensive as a violation of the Astana framework and called for immediate Russian intervention to halt the operation. What the readout did not mention was any Turkish military response, no counter-battery fire against Syrian positions, no deployment of Turkish armor across the border, no closure of Turkish airspace to Russian aircraft operating in the area. Turkey issued a statement. Turkey did not take action. This represents a significant shift because in February 2020, when Syrian forces last attempted a major push toward Idlib, Turkey responded by sending convoys of armored vehicles across the border, establishing new observation posts, and shooting down 2 Syrian helicopters. That operation, which Turkey called Spring Shield, killed 34 Turkish soldiers and pushed the conflict to the edge of direct Turkish-Russian confrontation. Erdogan threatened to open Turkey's borders to allow Syrian refugees to flood into Europe unless the offensive stopped. Russia brokered a ceasefire within 72 hours. This time, nothing. A statement of condemnation, a call for dialogue, but no meaningful military response. The reason Turkey is not responding the same way it did in 2020 is the same reason Russia felt comfortable launching this operation hours after signing an agreement with Turkey. The geopolitical context has fundamentally changed. In 2020, Turkey still had leverage with NATO, particularly with the United States, and could credibly threaten to block consensus on critical alliance decisions unless Western powers supported Turkish positions in Syria. In 2026, after 3 years of Turkish rapprochement with Russia on energy, defense procurement, and regional security issues, after Turkey's refusal to enforce sanctions on Russia following the Ukraine conflict, and after Ankara's increasing alignment with Shanghai Cooperation Organization frameworks rather than NATO structures, Turkey's ability to extract Western support for its Syria policy has evaporated. Turkey is isolated on Syria in a way it was not in 2020, and Russia knows it. That is why this offensive happened when it happened. Received. That is announcement number 2. Announcement number 3, and this one, almost nobody in the mainstream media is connecting correctly. Iran's silence. Tehran has not issued a statement on the Idlib offensive. Not from the Foreign Ministry, not from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, not from any Iranian official on the record. For a government that typically responds to regional developments within hours, often with lengthy analyses published through state media outlets like Press TV or Tasnim News Agency, this silence is deafening. And it is strategic. Iran's primary objective in Syria has never been territorial control in the northwest. Iran's objectives are the preservation of the Assad government, the maintenance of a land corridor connecting Tehran to Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the prevention of a Sunni Islamist government in Damascus that would align with Saudi Arabia or Turkey. The Idlib offensive serves all 3 objectives, but it does so without requiring Iranian forces to be visible or vulnerable. Syrian government troops and Russian air power are doing the work. Iranian-aligned militias are providing support in areas where their expertise in urban warfare and siege tactics is most valuable, but they are not leading the assault and they are not absorbing the casualties. This is what strategic depth looks like. Iran is achieving its Syria objectives through proxies and allies while preserving its own forces and avoiding direct confrontation with Turkey, a confrontation that could jeopardize Iranian interests in the Caucasus, Central Asia, and its critical economic relationship with Ankara on sanctions evasion and energy transit. Received. That is announcement number 3. Stay with me because this is where the narrative completely changes and where the human cost of this operation becomes impossible to ignore. According to the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the offensive that began on April 27th displaced approximately 47,000 civilians in the first 48 hours. 47,000 people, most of them women and children, most of them already displaced multiple times over the course of this 13-year conflict, fleeing north toward the Turkish border. The border is closed. Turkey is not accepting new refugees. The camps along the border are already operating at 180% of capacity. There is nowhere for these people to go. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, a UK-based monitoring group with sources inside Syria, reported that at least 93 civilians were killed in the first 3 days of the offensive, including 31 children. These deaths were caused by artillery fire, airstrikes, and in several documented cases, cluster munitions, weapons that are banned under international law but that Russian and Syrian forces have used repeatedly throughout this conflict. Real people are dying in Idlib, real families are being displaced, real children are watching their homes destroyed for the second, third, fourth time, and the international community, which spent years insisting that Syria was a moral test case for humanitarian intervention, is now largely silent. The United States issued a brief statement through the State Department expressing concern and calling for de-escalation. The European Union released a similar statement. Neither mentioned consequences, neither proposed action. The truth is that after 13 years, after 500,000 deaths, after the largest refugee crisis since World War II, the international community has exhausted its capacity for moral outrage over Syria, and the actors on the ground know it. That is why this offensive is happening now. There is no cost, there is no accountability, there is only the grinding logic of military facts on the ground. Now, let's talk about what is really happening behind the headlines, because there are two stories playing out simultaneously, and the mainstream media is only covering one of them. The first story, the one you are hearing about, is the humanitarian crisis, the displacement, the casualties, the condemnation from Western governments and human rights organizations. That story is real and it is important, but it is also incomplete. The second story, the one that will determine the actual outcome of this offensive and the future trajectory of the Syrian conflict, is the negotiation happening between Russia, Turkey, and Iran over the post-conflict political settlement in Syria. The Astana Agreement was never about stopping the fighting. It was about establishing the framework for who controls what territory when the fighting eventually stops. Russia wants a unified Syria under Assad, with Russian military bases permanently established on the Mediterranean coast. Iran wants a Syria that remains within its sphere of influence and provides access to Lebanon. Turkey wants a buffer zone along its border that prevents Kurdish autonomy and allows for the return of Syrian refugees currently in Turkey. These three objectives are not fully compatible, which is why the fighting continues. Each actor is trying to improve its negotiating position before the final settlement. Turkey's non-response to this offensive is not weakness, it is calculation. Erdogan is betting that allowing Russia and Syria to consolidate control over Idlib and the M4-M5 highway network now will give Turkey leverage to demand concessions elsewhere, specifically in northeastern Syria, where Turkish forces want to expand operations against Kurdish groups that Ankara considers terrorist organizations. Russia has historically blocked Turkish operations in the northeast because those areas are under nominal U.S. protection, and Russian forces are trying to avoid direct confrontation with American troops. But if Turkey accepts Russian gains in the northwest, Russia may accept Turkish gains in the northeast. That is the trade that is being negotiated right now, and the people of Idlib are the currency. Think carefully about what this represents. When three regional powers negotiate a stabilization agreement and then one of them launches a major military offensive 11 hours later, and the other two issue statements but take no action, that is not a breakdown in diplomacy. That is diplomacy. That is how spheres of influence get carved up when the international order that was supposed to prevent such carve-ups has collapsed and no actor with the capability to stop it has the will to intervene. President Trump responded to the Idlib offensive with a post on Truth Social stating that Syria is Russia's problem now and the United States has no intention of getting dragged back into Middle Eastern conflicts. European leaders echoed similar sentiments in less blunt language. The message to Moscow, Tehran, and Ankara is clear. Do what you want. Divide Syria however you see fit. We are done. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and every time it repeats, the outcome is the same. The Peloponnesian War, Athens, and Sparta exhausted themselves in a 27-year conflict that devastated the Greek world. Both sides claimed they were fighting for freedom, for democracy, for security. Both sides committed atrocities. Both sides made alliances with powers they despised when tactical necessity required it. And when the war finally ended, with Sparta nominally victorious but economically ruined, and Athens defeated but not destroyed, the real winner was Macedonia. Philip II and his son Alexander built an empire on the wreckage of the Greek city-states that had bled themselves into irrelevance. Syria today is following that pattern. The Assad government, Russia, Iran, Turkey, the opposition factions, ISIS remnants, Kurdish forces, they are all exhausting themselves. They are all spending resources, lives, and political capital on a conflict that has no clear end state. And who is positioned to benefit? China. Beijing has stayed almost entirely out of the Syrian conflict militarily. No troops, no airstrikes, no direct involvement. But China has made clear through statements from foreign ministry officials and through its Belt and Road Initiative planning documents that it intends to play a central role in Syria's reconstruction. Billions of dollars in infrastructure investment, port development, telecommunications networks, energy projects. China is waiting for the fighting to stop so it can buy the peace. The parallel is exact. Russia is Athens, pouring resources into a conflict to maintain regional influence. Turkey is Sparta, fighting to secure its borders and prevent threats it perceives as existential. Iran is Persia, playing both sides to advance its own imperial objectives. And China is Macedonia, building strength while everyone else bleeds. When the Syrian conflict finally ends, when the last ceasefire holds, when the reconstruction begins, the power that emerges dominant will not be the one that won the most battles. It will be the one that preserved its strength and positioned itself to define the post-conflict order. So where does this leave us? Let me give you three clear paths because there is no honest middle ground here. Path 1, the offensive continues for another 2 to 3 weeks. Syrian government forces consolidate control over the M4 and M5 highways and the major population centers in Idlib province. Turkey accepts the new reality in exchange for Russian acquiescence to Turkish operations in the northeast, and a new ceasefire is signed that essentially ratifies the military facts on the ground. Humanitarian organizations gain limited access to deliver aid, displaced populations remain in camps along the Turkish border, and the international community moves on to the next crisis. Likelihood, I assess this at 60%. This is the path of least resistance, the path that allows all major actors to declare some version of victory and avoid the costs of continued escalation. Path 2, Turkey decides that accepting Russian gains in Idlib undermines Turkish credibility and national security to an unacceptable degree. Ankara deploys armored units across the border to reinforce Turkish observation posts. Russia responds with airstrikes against Turkish positions. Casualties on both sides escalate, and we end up in a direct Russia-Turkey military confrontation that neither side wants, but that neither side can back down from once it begins. NATO is forced to decide whether Article 5 applies to Turkish forces operating inside Syria. The alliance fractures over that question, and the Syrian conflict metastasizes into a broader regional war. Likelihood, I assess this at 25%, lower probability but catastrophic consequences if it occurs. Path 3, the offensive stalls. Syrian government forces overextend their supply lines. Opposition groups reinforced by Turkish artillery and intelligence support launch counterattacks. Russian air power proves insufficient to hold gains without committing ground troops that Moscow is unwilling to deploy. And we return to the stalemate that has characterized northwestern Syria for the past 4 years. The Astana Agreement becomes the basis for another round of negotiations that produce another ceasefire that lasts another 6 months before the cycle repeats. Likelihood, 15%. This path requires the opposition to demonstrate capabilities they have not shown in recent years and requires Russia to accept a humiliating failure to achieve objectives. I think we are closer to Path 1 than the headlines suggest. The Russian offensive is succeeding, Turkish resistance is rhetorical, not military. The international community is disengaged. The humanitarian catastrophe is immense, but it is not new, and it is not sufficient to change the strategic calculus of any major actor. What happens in Syria over the next 72 hours will be determined by conversations happening in Moscow, Ankara, and Tehran, not by events on the ground in Idlib. The fighting is the negotiation, the casualties are the price of the settlement, and the people of Syria, who have paid every price for 13 years, will pay this one too. Here are the questions I want you to take away. First, if Turkey accepts Russian control of Idlib in exchange for freedom of action against Kurdish forces in northeastern Syria, what does that mean for American troops currently stationed in that region? Second, if China positions itself as the primary investor in Syrian reconstruction, what influence does that give Beijing over a government that is supposed to be aligned with Moscow and Tehran? And third, if the international community allows Syria to be partitioned by regional powers without consequence, what precedent does that set for other frozen conflicts in Libya, Yemen, and Ukraine? Tell me in the comments what you think Turkey does next. Tell me if you think the United States withdraws from northeastern Syria entirely or maintains a presence to counter Iranian influence. We will keep tracking every development in Syria, every movement along the M4 highway, every statement from Astana, Moscow, Ankara, and Tehran. That is what this analysis does every single day. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with everyone in your network who is trying to understand what is actually happening in Syria beyond the headlines. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update, and we will see you in the next briefing.